Buon pomeriggio, benvenuti nell'aula magna del Politecnico per questa ultima giornata del Festival della Tecnologia. Sono Juan Carlos De Martin, sono un docente qui al Politecnico e sono uno dei curatori di questa manifestazione insieme a Luca De Biase, che è seduto lì in seconda fila, e insieme allo stesso rettore del Politecnico, Guido Saracco, che è impegnato in un altro incontro. Questa lezione magistrale che adesso tra pochissimo sentirete è una lezione a cui teniamo particolarmente perché questo, come avete capito, è un festival della tecnologia e del suo rapporto con l'individuo, con la società, con la natura, quindi una riflessione sulla tecnologia molto ampia, e quindi avete sentito parlare filosofi, artisti, quindi non soltanto ingegneri come me, ma persone che hanno linguaggi e forme di sapere diverse dalle nostre, da quelle che coltiviamo, almeno come ingegneri qua in questo Politecnico. E quindi ci sembrava molto importante nell'affrontare una tecnologia così determinante per i nostri tempi come la tecnologia digitale, avere la voce di uno studioso che ormai da molti anni si fa conoscere e apprezzare in tutto il mondo, uno studioso che ha provato a guardare la tecnologia con uno sguardo più distaccato, più oggettivo, più critico di quanto non fosse comune fare fino a qualche anno fa. Parlo della tecnologia digitale che, come tutti sapete, o almeno sicuramente per me che me ne occupo, ha avuto una stagione durata parecchi anni di entusiasmo acritico, dove tutto ciò che arrivava tipicamente da Silicon Valley era per definizione nuovo, bellissimo, interessante, positivo, progresso indiscutibile, e l'oratore che vi sto per presentare invece, con discreto anticipo rispetto a molti altri, aveva cominciato a dire attenzione, rallentiamo, questo è irragionevole, non sempre ma spesso irragionevole, e quindi molto giovane si era fatto conoscere con un primo libro che ha fatto scalpore proprio perché era così chiaramente controcorrente rispetto all'entusiasmo un po' superficiale di quegli anni, e col passare del tempo, io lo conobbi allora, col passare del tempo il nostro ospite, che a questo punto nominiamo Evgenij Morozov, che è seduto qua in prima fila e che adesso andrà al podio, ha continuato a fare la cosa più importante, cioè ha continuato a studiare, perché il tema della tecnologia e il suo rapporto con la società è un tema molto ampio, complesso, su cui ci sono molte cose che vanno studiate prima di poter parlare con ragionevole certezza o comunque con un po' di solidità, e Evgenij ha studiato e continua a studiare tantissimo, molto più di molte altre persone. Tra l'altro vi segnalo una sua nuova iniziativa molto interessante che si chiama The Syllabus. Syllabus è una parola latina che in italiano in realtà significa il prospetto dei corsi universitari, quindi il titolo del corso, di cosa parla il corso e cosa leggere per il corso. E lui ha lanciato da poco tempo, a settembre se ben ricordo, questa iniziativa dove condivide in realtà con noi l'enorme quantitativo di cose che gli capita di leggere e di studiare, e quindi ci fa un servizio straordinario. Vi invito a iscrivervi, è una newsletter gratuita che trovate appunto se cercate The Syllabus. Appunto, quindi Evgenij Morozov studia, e questo, scusate, lo sottolineo perché è importante, perché è la base poi per poter riflettere seriamente su questi temi. E quindi con grande piacere che l'abbiamo invitato, e siamo felici che abbia accettato il nostro invito di venire a condividere con noi le sue riflessioni sulla tecnologia, con una visione ormai molto ampia, nel senso che sentirete come la riflessione sulla tecnologia è una riflessione ormai a tutti gli effetti politica, dove per politica intendo chiaramente la riflessione sul nostro vivere collettivo insieme, non politica nel senso di attività dei partiti politici, che è la riflessione fondamentale, perché chi pensa che la tecnologia sia qualcosa di appunto meramente tecnico, estraneo, che risolve certi problemi e non ne coglie invece la natura profondamente politica, ha una visione, una comprensione molto limitata del problema. E ovviamente questo vale per tutta la tecnologia, non soltanto per quella digitale, vale per l'energia, per i trasporti e per tutto, ma oggi ci concentreremo sul digitale. Direi che forse ho introdotto già a sufficienza Evgenij Morozov, e quindi per non sottrarre tempo prezioso alla riflessione, abbiamo 75 minuti in tutto prima della fine dell'incontro, gli darei il benvenuto e li inviterei a raggiungere il podio.
Thank you so much, Juan Carlos, for inviting me, and also to Luca De Biasi, your fellow co-curator, for organizing this wonderful festival. It's a pleasure to be back in Turin, especially at a time when it seems that finally the politics and economics of technology and of the so-called big tech, they have reached the center of public attention and public debate. I can tell you from my own experience that when I began ringing the alarm, so to say, about Silicon Valley 10 years ago or so, it felt quite lonely out there. And it continued being so for many years to come. And it's only roughly in 2016, 2017, that the more mainstream voices started paying attention to Silicon Valley and to big tech and to the emerging technology industry in China, and they started talking about it in quite drastic and dramatic terms. So to some extent, I get asked this question a lot actually by journalists. 2019 might feel like a victory for public intellectuals like myself, who have been dreaming and longing for such a robust public discussion as we are having now. Me being me, a cynical Eastern European, I'm of course not satisfied with the direction in which the debate about technology has unfolded over the last decade. And I'll try to explain to you why in my talk, but also try to uncover some of the hidden sides that are currently not being addressed, but that I think we should be addressing as soon as we can. The debate as it has unfolded in the last 3 years is heavily influenced by a certain set of concerns, right? If Donald Trump was not elected President of the United States, I would argue that much of the anxiety and concern that we currently have about so-called big tech, it would never even surface, right? So the anxiety that politicians in Washington and Brussels have about Google and Facebook does not have to do with them perceiving that some structural transformations of the public sphere, of the economy are taking place. Rather, it has to do with a much more short-term political agenda of trying to find whom to blame for the victory of Donald Trump or for the victory of Brexit. The end results of this soul-searching might, of course, be beneficial and useful even to a project like the one I endorse, but these questions are not being asked for the right reason. A very similar set of remarks can be made about the discussion we've been having about competition. Right? If you look to the debate that's happening on the question of big tech in Brussels, for example, you will see that it's almost entirely dominated by the question of size of these firms, on the assumption that Google and Facebook and Amazon, being as big as they are, represent a threat to a fully competitive market economy, they represent a threat to startups, and that as long as we can find a way to make them smaller, the problems associated with this industry will almost naturally go away. So 20 little Facebooks would serve us better than one giant Facebook. And even though I'm overstating the case here, I think that this is also a very naive way to frame our current technological condition and predicament, in that it assumes that the problem in the room to be addressed has to do just with the traditional problem of antitrust and monopoly, and that we can just use the conventional toolkit and address it, and that there is nothing that's being changed at the structural level. Right? So society continues working as it did 100 years ago, so all these parallels between data and oil, they serve a very particular function, right? Politically, but also linguistically. It's to establish in our mind this perception that there is nothing new under the sun, and that the risks and threats that are posed by this digital industry are exactly the same risks and threats that we have already dealt with 100 years ago. Now, just like in the previous example with the election of Donald Trump and all this anxiety about fake news, it's possible that some of the agendas advanced to act on this problem. So breaking up the big tech, breaking Facebook into 20 smaller Facebooks, or separating Instagram and WhatsApp from the mothership that is Facebook, all of those tactical measures might actually coincide with the political and economic project that I would like to enact and see. But we have to know the reasons as to why we would be doing all of that, right? And the reasons that I would like to outline to you today for why we should care about big tech and why we should actually address this problem as a structural problem of our society and not just some kind of a consequence of monopolization of power or concentration of economic activity. All of those reasons have to be thought through and articulated clearly, right? So tactically, I would be more than happy to make alliances with people in Brussels, people like Vestager, and people who would really like to do something to reduce the power of big tech. But we have to understand that to be truly effective, such measures have to be tied to a program of what will come after. And so far, most of the critics of big tech have not managed to offer anything even remotely comparable to that. So once we break up big tech, we ask to believe that normalcy will somehow come into place, and we will go back to the good old times of 1960s and 1970s, before we had Google and Facebook. And the reason why so many people do not feel warm about this idea and this agenda is precisely because they just do not believe that this normalcy will be arriving, right? And unless the critics of big tech manage to articulate a very specific and concrete agenda, intellectually, politically, and economically, what kind of digital and technological world they would like to build. Once big tech is gone from the picture, I think they are not going to mobilize popular support for the agenda. And I think it's very important for us to conceptualize the problem properly. That's why, at the very outset of this lecture, I would like to reject the traditional framings of this problem as just a bunch of rogue companies that engage in propagation of fake news, or as giants that have usurped economic power, or as companies that usurp our privacy, right? Or as anti-humanists who do not really fully understand what it is to be human, so they engage in all sorts of behavioral manipulation and Skinnerian operant conditioning. I mean, those are all the sort of intellectual framings that have gained currency in the last few years, and I would argue that all of them do not capture a very fundamental and political and historical nature of big tech, right? And it's through my brief intervention here at the lecture that I hope to fill in these missing gaps from the picture that so far has emerged of big tech and its political power. And this is why I think we have to choose our historical framings and narratives wisely. It's one thing to set and situate Silicon Valley in the utopian years of 1990s, which is the common framing, that essentially it's a bunch of people who have got together in Silicon Valley. They understood that the history was about to end because they've read Francis Fukuyama. They had access to venture capital money. Government that has previously controlled the internet withdrew its support. And we got this digital utopia of people who are very libertarian, who basically live in Palo Alto in a bubble of their own, and who are now causing all the problems that we are having. I would argue that this is the conventional framing of Silicon Valley, and that's the historical underpinning, the historical kind of narrative that structures our thought about it. And it's a framing common both to the critics of Silicon Valley, but also to its proponents. So this is what gives us this idea of Californian ideology, for people who are familiar with this from some readings of the critics of Silicon Valley. But it also gives us this confident perception of people like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos that they are really on the cutting edge of history and that they are, to some extent, the culmination of this emancipatory wave that began with the fall of the Berlin Wall and then continued with the fall of the Soviet Union, and Silicon Valley enters onto this landscape almost naturally, which tells us just how these people could possibly think that they were the key intermediaries of the so-called Twitter or Facebook revolution in 2009 and 2011, right? When the Arab Spring was unfolding, our default mode of interpretation was, of course, to think that it's ultimately this industry that has done so much to liberate and emancipate us. I would argue that this narrative is not entirely incorrect, but it's incomplete. And in order to fully understand the power of Silicon Valley and technology companies, but also the ramifications and the consequences that they hold for society at large, we must start much earlier. So we need to start not with 1990s, but plausibly with 1930s, 1940s. And here I'm not talking so much about fascism or Nazism, rather I'm talking about efforts to essentially build and secure a world that would be hospitable for markets and neoliberal capitalism. And I think it's very important to time the true origins of this knowledge utopia that Silicon Valley would eventually come to embody properly. And this is why I would argue that doing a thorough political and historical reading of Silicon Valley through the lens of the birth of neoliberalism is actually a very useful exercise, because it helps us understand a particular function that this industry and this set of firms comes to occupy in the current political system. And I would argue that despite the fact that there are many definitions of what neoliberalism is, and what role it has served throughout the years, and there is even disagreement about the decades in which it was most active and prevalent, I would offer a very simple definition of what it is. I would argue that it's an effort, essentially, to instill and install market civilization by foreclosing and shutting down any alternative forms of non-market social coordination and living, right? Which does not mean that those forms of non-market coordination cannot come in useful when it comes to making and creating an environment hospitable to markets and capitalism, but you cannot possibly allow them to scale up to a point where they can actually threaten the existence of this market-based civilization. So it's a very packed statement I've just given you, so let me unpack it a little bit. And I don't want to spend too much on the history of neoliberalism because I would really like to focus on technology, but I think we cannot just ignore this elephant in the room. So initially, of course, the efforts of various neoliberal thinkers who got together and started thinking about policy interventions that could secure capitalism and make it robust, right? They had to do with the threats of communism. And the fact that workers who at that point represented the avant-garde of political opposition to capitalism could actually seize power and organize a very different state that would not be hospitable to capitalism. And the Soviet Union, from that perspective, represented a very potent adversary model of how things could go wrong, right? And it was precisely in response to that very real historical challenge that the neoliberal thinkers began organizing and building ideas and institutions that would, in one way or another, secure the foundations of this market civilization. And I think it's very important to understand that ultimately it was a mix of utopian thinking on the one hand and very crude realism that you would expect from someone like Henry Kissinger. On the utopian side, right, there was always lurking behind neoliberal agenda at least, this idea that knowledge properly utilized in society could deliver higher standards of living, that it is basically key to the improvement of our living, and it's key to progress. And what we need to do is to build the right sorts of institutions and structures so that this knowledge can be utilized most efficiently and effectively by everyone. That was essentially, if you read Hayek or Mises, the intellectual fathers of the neoliberal project closely, that was their utopian dream, that we would be able to essentially deploy knowledge through the price mechanism in such a way that producers will always have incentives to compete with each other, so they will always be on the lookout for new R&D, for new techniques of production, for new innovations, because it's through those innovations that they manage to reduce costs and undercut their competitors, right? So there was always this pressure inside the capitalist system to generate new knowledge, because this knowledge is key to survival of the firms. But on the consumer end, there was always also a mechanism for deploying knowledge, because consumers left to their own devices and being able to purchase goods from multiple suppliers and firms would always come up with new needs. They would always come up with new anxieties or aspirations. Those needs would be translated into new products. So consumers too will be vehicles, in some sense, of advancement of knowledge generation, and that knowledge generation will eventually translate to higher standards of living. Right? So there was always this very utopian underpinning behind the neoliberal project, which was very much based on this idea of the knowledge society. From the very beginning, everything revolved around knowledge. Right? And that knowledge is essentially the way to make things better, and there was always this underpinning and kind of flavor of progress to the neoliberal agenda. And I think we should not confuse it with outright conservatism, right? Because there was always, this is why, by the way, Hayek wrote that famous essay, "Why I'm Not a Conservative," there was always this promise of new things coming into existence as long as markets and capitalism work properly. Now, this is the utopian part of the promise. The realistic part of the promise was basically to say that any alternatives to this particular model, where markets elicit the knowledge of consumers and push producers to compete with each other, any alternative to it will eventually lead to totalitarianism. Right? So if you deviate from this world and society, where markets are at the very core of how society and knowledge extraction and production are organized, you're going to end up with Stalin and the gulags. Right? And it's against this kind of alternative scenario, or what could go wrong, that the neoliberal project, with its celebration of market civilization, was actually built and erected. And there were arguments made as to how, once people are allowed to organize into ways that do not presume consumption or production as the primary activity and the primary identity, they will eventually end up in institutions that will be collectivist, and they will be demanding more and more of the state. And this reveals to us one of the key invisible and understudied premises of the neoliberal project. It's almost an algorithmic utopia of communitarianism, in a sense, because the interests of everyone, of producers and consumers and the state, through the workings of the market system and the price system, they're mutually adjusted to each other. So the interests of consumers are realigned with the interests of producers are realized with the interests of the state, and even though everybody pursues their own agenda, through the magic of the invisible hand, somehow social progress is achieved. Right? Because consumers, all that they can demand in their identity as consumers are lower prices. And as long as they demand lower prices, that pushes firms to innovate, that reduces prices, that allows us to come up with more efficient techniques of production, everything becomes cheaper, standards of living rise, social progress is achieved. Right? So you see how the market functioned basically as some kind of an algorithm inside this communitarian communal utopia, where all of the different parts of it, labor and capital especially, but also the state, were mutually reconciled with one another. The state, of course, did not disappear from this view and from this picture. The state was supposed to be there precisely to make this reconciliation between labor and capital work. and to make it functional. If that meant introducing more reforms and more measures to open up more areas to market logic and market civilization, the state would do that, right? This is why, if you read good histories of neoliberalism, you will see that the state has been fundamental to enacting that agenda. Now, against this background, it's quite obvious that an industry that is so heavily based and grounded in knowledge and data and communication, it would be seen as a savior and a kind of a natural embodiment of the neoliberal logic. Because ultimately, an industry that allows you to completely personalize your experience, to make it in a way unique, right? It's the culmination of this dream of the sovereign consumer that has always been at the heart of the neoliberal project, right? So if you start from the assumption that your identity as a parent, or your identity as a member of a trade union, or as your member as a church, or as a member of any other kind of non-market-based organization, if you start from the assumption that those identities always have to take secondary role to your identity as a consumer, right? You do end up with a world where all of your desires and wishes and anxieties can be satisfied in a semi-automated manner by Amazon and Alexa monitoring your every move and serving you products without you even realizing that you have ever ordered them, right? So to some extent, Amazon, but to some extent also Google, represent the culmination of this logic and rhetoric around sovereign consumer as the key political subject of the neoliberal utopia. At the same time, of course, we have the production side, where firms have found ways to expand into areas that have traditionally been off limits, even for many neoliberals. So if you go and read Hayek carefully, and you read, some of his essays where he's a little bit less careful than in his books, you will see that he supports quite a few of the social democratic initiatives. He's not against welfare state. He supports some basic forms of planning when it comes, for example, to urban planning. And he's basically a mild social democrat of 1940s or 1950s. Right? The problem is that, of course, many of the structural problems inside capitalism that neoliberalism could never solve, let alone acknowledge, have undermined the conditions under which this neoliberal utopia, in its most productive communitarian kind of fashion, actually functioned in the 60s and the 70s. So the utopian vision which I've outlined to you, where the interests of consumers are aligned with interests of producers and the state mediates them in a very efficient way, it functioned only very briefly, if ever, because there have always been problems that this theory could never actually recognize and acknowledge as existing in the system itself. Because ultimately, there was always a lot of turbulence that this system couldn't handle. And the turbulence was usually hidden somewhere in some invisible part of the system, which was never properly theorized, right? So the key to the survival of the system was, of course, making sure that capitalist firms made enough profit, because if they did not make any profit, the entire system threatened to fall apart. And the way to achieve that profit, as we know now, has not always been particularly honest or transparent. Capitalist firms, especially in the West, in the Western Europe and North America, have ensured profitability through all sorts of ways, none of which, in retrospect, looking particularly honest. First, it was by engaging in all sorts of neo-imperialist and neo-colonialist extractive activities, which ensured cheap supply of products and raw supplies at the expense of many developing nations. Then it became about finding ways to profit from free labor of others, not just in the neo-colonial kind of sphere, but also in the domestic sphere. So the work of many people, from women to eventually and later immigrants, has never been properly compensated, with a lot of capitalist firms free riding on it quite successfully. Eventually, we found ways in which energy could be used as a source of cheap and inexpensive and very often free inputs, which also drastically reduced cost of production, but created a huge mess, which we're only now beginning to deal with. And eventually, this cheapness of production has been revolutionized by another set of inputs, which relate to data, of course. So you can see that if you go and do this long-term kind of historical view on how capitalist firms have dealt with the problems they've encountered in the capitalist system in which they operated, you will see that it has always been about outsourcing and hiding costs and dumping them on others, which, even neoclassical economists, in all of their naivete, have actually managed to recognize as externalities. Right? So it's not an unknown problem, it's just that many of these activities were never properly accounted for, even by economists themselves, because they had to do with very nasty problems like imperialism, patriarchy, excessive energy consumption, and what have you. And now we are basically arriving at a point where the last frontier through which this model could survive is by essentially hoovering in and sucking in as much data as possible, right, at zero cost, because it's not recognized, just like domestic labor was not recognized, or just like energy was not recognized, or just like commodities from the third world were not recognized, and it's being essentially inputted into production, and it is the key ingredient in artificial intelligence and other similar services, which are then packaged and offered at a high fee to government and business clients, right? But even there, you see that the process is not smooth at all, right? So just like in the original efforts to make the foundations of the system resilient and robust, you always bump into problems. So you bump into a problem like Cambridge Analytica and fake news, right? You bump into a problem like surveillance. You bump into a problem like people essentially asking questions about whether they would like their city to be run by Google or Amazon, the way it's now happening, for example, in Toronto. I'm saying all of this only to illustrate to you one trend, which I think is very important. And it has to do with the fact that as this crisis, or series of crises, have hit the capitalist system, right? As it started running out of resources and as the cost started raising up, it had only one possible strategy to survive, and that strategy was expanding and penetrating into more and more social domains and converting them to the logic of market civilization, right? So if Hayek in 1940s and 1950s was a supporter, if maybe a mild one, of the welfare state, and making sure that the healthcare system and the education system were actually provided through the welfare state and not through the private market, now we end up in a situation where the necessities of keeping the show running force both governments and the corporate providers of the services to actually enter into areas and social domains which were previously free from any penetration of the market logic, right? So you end up with healthcare suddenly becoming the domain of IBM and Google, with education the domain of Google and Microsoft, with transportation the domain of Uber and Lyft, and with many other areas and domains of social existence that so far have remained immune to the market logic, being converted into the most profitable playgrounds where this logic can unfold and these domains can be actually integrated into the global capitalist system. Now, this of course generates a lot of turmoil, as we have seen with strikes by Uber drivers and what have you, but it also highlights the fact that despite the tremendous efficiency of many of the systems and many of these platforms, it's still not obvious whether they can actually turn a profit, right? So we are kind of back into the problem where we started, that the efforts to secure the foundations of the capitalist system and to actually guarantee that there is still some profitability left, they fail, as we have currently seen with Uber, which keeps losing something like $5 or $6 billion a year, and WeWork, which currently has gone from a company with a valuation of 60 or 70 billion to a company that might be valued just at 8 billion and maybe at nothing at all. Right? And all of that has to do with the fact that most of the profits booked by this industry are completely artificial. Right? They are the result of too much money from hungry investors who have been starved by the financial crisis, directing their capital towards an industry that, everything else being equal, does offer the possibility of reinvigorating or rekindling, to some extent, the capitalist and the neoliberal narrative. You cannot rekindle it around finance. You cannot rekindle it around real estate. Right? There is no production there. Nothing gets produced in finance or real estate except a few services and commodities that are really trivial, like derivatives or financial products. Right? So you cannot actually have people have faith, right, in the way in which the entire neoliberal setup works without presenting something that mildly resembles innovation. And Silicon Valley comes at this particular moment. It's presented as an industry that has managed to resolve all of these old contradictions inside the neoliberal capitalist system. And not only does it not need to exploit anybody, it actually liberates us, right? It highlights this identity of us as sovereign consumers, and it essentially does everything in a way that's much more sustainable, much more efficient, and above all, much free, right? That, at least, is the rhetoric that hides behind the package. Now, I think I've said enough to convince you that much of that rhetoric is just that, right? There is no real substance backing it up. And it's essentially just a bunch of venture capitalists and sovereign wealth funds acting together with the funders and founders of these companies who have created this ideological structure which all of us have bought into for the last 5 or 10 years, and some of us are beginning to have second thoughts about how well it actually works, especially if you try to tell this longer story about the history of capitalism since 1930 onwards. What I would like to argue in the remaining time that I have is that the initial premise on which the neoliberal project was built, which gave us Silicon Valley as the only possible version of digital society, that initial premise is flawed. And the premise I'm talking about it is this realistic assumption made by Hayek that any departure from market logic when it comes to knowledge aggregation and creation is going to lead us to Gulag, Stalinism, and totalitarianism. Right? That was an assumption that was made in very political circumstances in 1940s and 1950s. And it was an assumption that was very easy to believe in because you actually had the Soviet Union, and you could actually say that what happened in the Soviet Union was just a natural consequence of their attitude to knowledge. They decided to engage in central planning. Central planning, of course, suppresses all of the things that Hayek and Mises loved so much about neoliberalism. Consumers cannot express their wishes and desires. Firms have no incentives to compete. So knowledge that is otherwise generated in a capitalist system through the markets and the price system is not there. That's why the Soviet system lags behind. It cannot actually adequately plan. It doesn't know what's happening inside its own factories, and eventually it withers away. That was also the explanation that many people in the neoliberal camp gave of the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, I would argue that there is no reason for us in 2019 to hold on to this binary view. It's definitively not the case that the only instances in which knowledge is produced are those where price mechanisms and the markets are involved. You all know it from your own everyday life experience. You all have to invent new things as you go about talking to your family members, your friends, your community. We are always very inventive. If there is a problem in our neighborhood, and if we know how to address it ourselves and we know how to solve it, we will be able to solve it, right? There is no necessity for us to introduce the price mechanism and organize an auction about which of the neighbors is going to fix the broken light. We can argue, of course, about how we have become selfish and self-centered, and none of us cares about doing such things. But at the level of the family, we still coordinate quite well in the absence of any prices. right? When you talk to your relatives about when you're going to, I don't know, pick up your children from kindergarten, you do not set prices on whether you will go there at 4 or at 5, or whether you'll do it today or tomorrow. You do it because there is a very different set of relationships and a very different logic of solidarity, of patriarchy, of something else that structures that social coordination. And the reason why you can all do it through Telegram or WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger is because you actually have technologies that allow us to coordinate bypassing the price mechanism, right? Which was the key argument of somebody like Hayek. The reason why they thought markets are inevitable is because they thought that there is no other way for people with knowledge to share it and communicate with each other. Because they thought that the only other way was to dispatch inspectors and basically torture them and interview them and solicit all the knowledge and write it down, which might have been a realistic assumption for 1920s and 1930s, but it's definitely not a realistic assumption in 2019. Right? So there is no need for us to hold on to a framework which basically doesn't recognize the immense social potential and immense creativity that is inherent to all of us, and that can be unlocked with the right set of tools and infrastructures. We've seen a very early glimpse of what might come out of that creativity in the context of projects like Wikipedia and free software. Right? We have seen that people motivated by ideas and incentives other than the price system and the markets do come together, they do collaborate, and do produce things which are of very high quality. We can argue whether Wikipedia meets the epistemic standards of knowledge or not. This is an interesting debate, but this is not the point I'm trying to drive home here. The point I'm trying to drive home here is that given enough infrastructure and given enough opportunities, right, people do find ways to collaborate in ways that have nothing to do with markets and have nothing to do with central planning. And that's an insight that's so obvious, it's actually very puzzling that for the 20 or 30 years since the end of communism in the Soviet Union, we have not managed to actually fully understand it. And as an extension of this argument, it also becomes possible and obvious that if we manage to develop infrastructures of social collaboration and coordination, that would also allow people to pursue projects that will have nothing to do with trying to create an app or trying to create a startup, we might actually end up with a society that will be much richer and much more innovative than it ever was. And I would argue that it's precisely through such kinds of social innovations and such kind of institutional imaginary tinkering that we have managed to achieve such huge progress. If you look at some of the institutions we have designed in the last 100 years, the welfare state, the library, the post office, none of them rely at their core on the price mechanism or on market logic. Right? They are there not only because they are supposed to somehow mitigate the vagaries of the market or to make us more resilient and less precarious. They are there because we genuinely believe that by suspending these rules and logic of the market and the price system, we might actually achieve more innovation. Right? This is the reason why we have libraries. Right? They are not just a tool of making knowledge more accessible to everyone. They're also there because we genuinely believe that essentially suspending copyright law and suspending the operations of the normal capitalist system actually yields experiences and collaborations that are richer. Right? And that, in the end, result in more prosperity, progress, and social well-being. And I think that it's time that we learn the full lessons of such institutional tinkering and such social innovation, and we try to scale them up. Right? This is why I think it's imperative that forces that have traditionally defended the welfare state and non-market forms of coordination, whether they are in the social democratic camp, whether they are in some kind of a Christian democratic camp, that they actually start thinking seriously about technology, but not as a very instrumental force that can help them achieve some gains in the next electoral campaign, which is an important objective, but that cannot be the only issue that these forces should think about. They should think about technology as absolutely key and fundamental to reformulating what their project is all about. Because unless they manage to tease out and articulate this logic and this relationship between community and solidarity and humanity and humanism on the one hand, and technology on the other, and understand what kind of political economy and what kind of public policy would give us the technology we need to produce more solidarity and humanism and cooperation, we will be lost. Because we will end up with the services provided by Silicon Valley, which might serve and deliver in the short term some of the gains we expect. So clearly they will make education more accessible in the short term at the cost of foreclosing other possible mechanisms of social coordination and social cooperation. And this, I think, is key to understanding what liberty and freedom really mean today. Right? They do not mean, as Silicon Valley would have it, having full consumer sovereignty where every single wish and desire of yours can be satisfied by a drone delivering products that you have ordered while talking to Alexa, regardless of the consequences of consuming those products for the environment, for each other, for your family, or for your city. Right? That cannot be an accepted definition of liberty and freedom that we operate with. I think we need a richer one, and that richer one should somehow incorporate the idea that we should have full plasticity over our social environment of some kind, where we can form new institutions, where we can form and practice, and actually form new practices and practice them, where we can form new communities around certain activities that are not just those pushed to us by Facebook or Google or Amazon. And if we really want those practices to scale up, the way the welfare state scaled up, or the way the library scaled up, we would need to do it not just in an ad hoc basis through small urban communities working in progressive cities like Turin or Milan or somewhere else. We would need to do it through the state. And this is where the neoliberal project kind of starts pushing back. And I think that until we fully realize what it means at the level of the state, and in the case of Europe, at the level of the European Union, to engage in this kind of progressive political agenda, we will end up with these ad hoc interventions which will make us somewhat less sad, but ultimately will have no impact on the structural conditions in which politics unfolds today. Right? And this is where it's very instructive and useful, I think, to reflect upon this longer history of neoliberalism, which I defined very explicitly at the beginning as an effort to prevent any non-market forms from scaling up. It's really the scaling up that matters in our case, because it's very easy to imagine, and that in fact has happened, many of the neoliberal thinkers embracing institutions like the family, embracing institutions like the church, embracing any of the social associations that allow them to tie the hands of the state on the one hand, and on the other hand to lower the cost of social reproduction so that some of the costs that capitalist enterprises would need to carry otherwise would be pushed on the family or the church or the citizen association, right? Where they really get afraid is when such non-market institutions really start occupying a much larger space in society, which then threatens capitalist accumulation and shrinks the markets, right? And I think that the only way for us to address problems like inequality, to address all of the problems of contemporary capitalism, is to start filling in the spaces with alternative logics that do not default to those of the market and of the price system. And we will need to fill them in with something. We will not be able to fill them in with central planning, as the Soviet Union has done, and we will not be able to fill them in with, the church. Those days, I think, are gone as well. So we will have to think strategically about technology, and we will have to think strategically about how it can be deployed to build structures that thrive on solidarity and that thrive on collaboration and cooperation. And I think without fully acknowledging that task, we will continue engaging in these very technocratic measures that might, in the short term, provide satisfaction, like breaking up Facebook or Google, but in the long term, they present absolutely no threat to the political project that I've been outlining to you today. This project will function just as well with 20 little Facebooks and 50 little Googles as it would work with just one or two of them. And even though breaking these firms up might actually help the alternative vision that I've been outlining here, as I said at the beginning, we have to know why exactly we are doing it. Unless we have that vision, we are not likely to actually make much of a difference. On this note, I think I will stop. I'll be more than happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Grazie molte a Evgenij Morozov per la sua lezione. Avete visto che era come avevo anticipato, riflessioni molto importanti. Abbiamo circa 20 minuti per un dialogo con lui e ci sarà un microfono quando qualcuno vuole fare una domanda, alza la mano, arriverà il microfono. Vedo già una domanda, però mi prendo la prerogativa di poter fare io la prima domanda prima di essere travolto dalle vostre e passo all'inglese. Just one very quick question from me before opening up to the floor. To the audience, do you think that central planning sounds bad because there's so many connotations, but don't you think that the state can actually play a role alongside the kind of community-based and solidarity-based initiatives that you were mentioning?
Mm-hmm. Well, that was the message I was trying to send at the very end of my talk. There is absolutely no way to resolve it without rethinking and re-involving the state into the matter. I'm absolutely convinced that given the political power of this industry, given the massive challenge of the problem, there is absolutely no way to bypass the state. That's why, I'm not presenting some kind of an anarchist, utopian, communitarian vision of communities being able to resolve everything on their own. On issues like, for example, artificial intelligence, where capital spending would be in the amount of hundreds of billions of dollars if you really want to compete or offer any kind of alternative to Google or Facebook or Microsoft, you clearly would not be crowdfunding for this AI on Kickstarter. You would clearly need to have a massive program of public investment. You will need to have political power. I mean, these companies are not going to take it lightly. The fact that you are now thinking about decommodifying social life the way that, during the early decades of the welfare state, we decommodified education or healthcare. I mean, I can assure you that a lot of companies were angry back then at what, for example, Roosevelt was doing with the New Deal, and a lot of companies would be quite angry now if you suddenly came and said, okay, so the deals that you've signed to provide the cloud computing and artificial intelligence services in education, in healthcare, in transportation, even in telecommunications. I've just seen that this week Team, your Italian company, has signed a deal with Google. I'm sure that neither of them will be happy. And I just don't think that activists or social groups have the savvy and the political power to resist the amount of pressure that will come on them. The problem, of course, is much more nuanced and greater, in fact, than what I've been saying, because you will be immediately taken to court by these very companies. You'll be taken to trade tribunals for threatening their profits. I mean, you already know how it works. You just look at Latin America. Once they've started claiming some sovereignty in the energy sector, Ecuador tried to act against Chevron, and Chevron took them to court for threatening their profits. And unfortunately, the trade treaties that we've been signing at the government level for the last few decades, they encourage this kind of behavior from companies. So it's not going to be an easy task, but it's absolutely key that this is something that's taken up by political parties, and it's absolutely key that this debate reaches the state, because otherwise I think it just remains at the level of empty talk.
Excellent. So let's open up the floor. I think there was a question over here. Other questions elsewhere.
So, the question is the following. The general picture is very interesting, very complete. I share completely this fundamental idea that there is an alternative to both pure market and central planning. That is, according to me, self-management, samoupravljanje, which is at the end the idea which you purport. But what puzzles me is that the main economic problems of today are not well connected with this shape. That means we have in Europe, in Italy, more than 50% of people who are outside the production market. So not only unemployed, but also people who are at home, children, retraitees, and so on. We have in these 40% who works, just a small amount who is working in industry. However, all what we see around us is produced by industry, the cars, the buildings, the food, the books, and what it is difficult to find, and should be described also in this framework that you outlined, yes, is how we can live with an industry which produces itself with the machines without people. The bulk of the population who is not producing and who must be paid because he must eat, he must have the money for traveling. How does your self-managed society work as concerns, yes, manufacturing and salaries?
Yes. So I do not accept such a, let's say, sharp distinction between production and non-production. I think it's, to some extent, it's the legacy of the industrial era. In that, for me, people who are engaged in social reproduction, we used to call it, people who engaged in the social sphere, whether it has to do with education, or whether it has to do with health, or whether it has to do with knowledge in libraries or somewhere else, they're as valuable to society as people who are producing cars. And I think they have to be recognized and acknowledged equally, in part because the conception that even some of the orthodox Marxists, not to take the people on the other side, have of the productive process, it's a bit misleading. And I think we have to find a way in which the gains generated in the non-industrial, non-productive parts of society will find a way to people who have been contributing. So in that sense, I'm not trying to endorse the agenda of basic income here, but to some extent, once you pair it with access, universal access to basic services, where you will ensure that people have free access to education, healthcare, transportation, and so forth, yes, an agenda of basic income would be marvelous. The problem is that in the current environment, it's being tied to nothing. So you get basic income, and then you have to pay 50 euros a month to team, and 40 euros to your energy provider, and another 60 to a water provider, and you end up in debt, which has also been one of the key instruments, which I haven't mentioned, to the survival of the system. So in that sense, I'm not particularly troubled by the fact that we are not going to have as many factories as we had before. That doesn't bother me, because wealth is still there. It's just appropriated very differently. And once you have a fully and properly functioning tax system, where you're not just pushing people at the lower levels of the ladder to pay more, but you're actually managing to tax the billionaires and the millionaires, there will be enough wealth to go around. We already have enough wealth to go around, we just don't tax it properly. So in that sense, I think the problem that we have right now is not being able to say the truth about how the current system works. And once we tell the truth about how the current system works, and we design an appropriate policy response to it, that problem will, by itself, almost disappear. It's not a problem, it's a problem of political power. It's not a problem of math or logic. And as long as the political power is there, I think we will know how to resolve it. The question that I would be asking is how do you get that political power?
Incoraggio in particolare i nostri studenti o gli studenti in generale presenti a fare domande, a non aver paura. Ok, vedo una domanda qui. Non so se... Ok, poi il signore. Prima il ragazzo qui, poi il signore.
Thank you. My question is about the role of the state, as you said, that we need the help of the state. Is the role of the state just a political and financial one, or are we also going to need some regulations done by it? Because I don't think that we can just rely on the morality in this Orwellian society that capitalism has created. So do you believe that we need this new market, new liberalist market society to be regulated or not?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, it depends on, I think the answer to this question depends on how one assesses the longevity and the chances of survival of the current system. I think it's being capped on a life support for quite a few years. So, and it's being kept on life support through that, through quantitative easing, through, hiding the real environmental cost of our activities. And, we can maybe, by finding new ways to deploy data, artificial intelligence, or engage in new forms of control, we'll put drones everywhere, the smart city will control your every move, we can prolong that state of life support by another decade or 15 or 20 years, and it will become very difficult to at the same time maintain the veneer of democratic legitimacy. Because clearly, once you deploy drones everywhere and people cannot actually move where they want to because there are actual limits and they're tied to their personal profile of some kind, you cannot claim to be a democracy. At best, you'll get Singapore as a service, right, deployed everywhere. Whether we'll need regulation ultimately depends on which path of action you'd like to prioritize. Because you can be passing a lot of laws that will help prolong that state of life support. I mean, I think it's important to pass laws that will ensure that we don't further stumble into a neo-fascist system of some kind. So I would focus on interventions that would actually ensure and guarantee rights to citizens. But it cannot be the only measure. So, I mean, I'm all for GDPR, right? But GDPR is not the right means to solve the problem that needs to be solved by industrial policy, geopolitical policy, and some other policy, right? And I don't think anybody who has pushed GDPR has argued that it's meant to do that. It's really when it comes to more political measures where we need to start asking questions. The problem is that the European Commission will always present itself as a non-political actor. So, because they're not allowed to have a policy. So they can enforce policies like European competition, And so you go and you talk to Vestager and you tell her, okay, but is there a bigger political, philosophical problem about big tech? She'll tell you, not my department. My department makes sure that consumer rights are not being abused because my department is competition. And this is where the problem is, right? The problem is that the national parties and national governments have not woken up to it, or they don't want to wake up to this problem. European Commission, by constitution and by default, cannot handle the more political questions, so we end up in limbo.
I thank you for your very fascinating reconstruction. My question concerns your historical overview.
Yes.
And speaking of the dinosaurs of the economic history in the 60s, the attempt to reform central planning system in Eastern Europe,
yes,
the Kazygin era and so on. In your opinion, first, it's something you dealt with. Secondly, in your opinion, it belongs to the, it's a variation on the history of neoliberalism, or is the point of departure of another possible way of thinking
yes.
the economy. I think, for example, the very interesting, simulating debates accompanying the Czechoslovakian reforms during the 60s, Radovan Richtenstein. Thank you very much.
I think it's a very good question because it opens up the right intellectual avenues for us. So in the 60s, you did have a an effort, even in the Soviet Union, to deploy cybernetics, to essentially make the planning system more agile and more rapid, and to respond a little bit to the situation, not just in terms of planning, but also in terms of bureaucracy, a little bit better. And those efforts were mostly concentrated in Kiev because they had the largest cybernetics academy in the Soviet Union. Those efforts were killed by the Soviet apparatchiks who saw cybernetics as essentially a threat to their political power and their political project. And later, of course, we've seen a kind of return to those ideas, or maybe a rediscovery of those ideas in the 70s in Chile, and Allende, when Allende brought this very prominent British cybernetician, Stafford Beer, to essentially optimize or at least somewhat flexibilize, if that's the right word, the Chilean economy, particularly when it came to the production of copper. And I think that, look, ultimately, you can and you should rely on information to resolve problems of information. I mean, that's a basic, I wrote a very long essay about it where I juxtaposed the thought of Stafford Beer with the thought of Hayek, and where I basically show that Hayek had a very simplistic conception of the markets, and then you had the family, and then there was the state, but there were no intermediate levels. And Stafford Beer, this other cybernetician, had a very different conception of the world, where he thought that, problems, it's almost like, in the Catholic thought you talk about subsidiarity. It was almost like subsidiarity principle, but with some cybernetic technologies mediating it. So the level that's most appropriate for dealing with the problem should be dealing with it. That's essentially the main insight of Stafford Beer, and once problems pile up, they should go up to the high levels, right? So in that sense, you can, of course, engage and employ some of the cybernetic insights, because this is what cybernetics is. It's a science of organization. How do you organize things and how you structure communication loops and mechanisms inside an institution. I just would not be applying it necessarily to the planning of the economy only, right? So clearly, I'm not, let's put it that way. I don't think that the alternative to the current system would be building a better and bigger and more robust and agile planned economy. I just don't think that's the case. You will need a lot of planning, and you will need a lot of bureaucracy, and you will need a lot of state, but you would not probably want to employ a system that intellectually is sort of flawed. There is nothing that ties planned economies to Marxism. It's an idea that comes from neoclassical economics of early 19th century, of early 20th century. There is absolutely nothing there which even remotely resembles Marxism. It's just a bunch of equilibrium equations which have been transposed to an economic system because the Soviets had no other way of organizing the economy, which is not our problem in the 21st century. So even though there are these efforts on the left to revive this intellectual system, I think they're flawed. We need something else. And I think that organizing a society in a way that knowledge and innovation can be produced, extracted, and formalized, it's one challenge. But trying to do it with planning is a very different one. I'm much more interested in the first challenge rather than in the second one.
My question to you is very simple. After exploitation of people, then we have seen the exploitation of the environment. Now, if I understand you, it's the time for data.
No.
Okay,
But okay, I'll complicate it.
Anyway, this is what I understood.
Yeah.
40, 50 years ago, we started to fight for environmental impact assessment, for legislation to protect the environment, and across the world, we have seen success of this. Do you see any sign in the society, organizations, who is starting to oppose the current use of data? Because legislation, as you said, is part of the solution, but it's not all. Without a civil opposition in the society, we will never see any real change.
Well, I think on the question of, to some extent, you're correct in presenting the symmetry. So from people to nature to data, the problem is data, it's nothing in itself, it's just the product of social relations. and it's the product of us essentially engaging in social activity with the state or with each other. So to some extent, it's the, you know what, I think Habermas was right about one thing, and it's about this idea of colonization of the life world. He just gave us this concept 30 years earlier than he should have. So in some sense, it is the further deepening and drilling down into exploitation, but it just now happens at a very different cognitive level, right? It happens at the level of the psyche and at the level of our inner and outer relations, and not just at the level of having us work 3 or 4 hours more and not paying us for it. Whether I see any initiatives that try to do what we have done with the environment, to be honest, I don't see great successes of the environmental legislation. I mean, the situation might have been much worse, but like I wouldn't put it the way you put it, that we're seeing successes of those interventions. I mean, we're seeing successes in that we're still alive, I mean, which is already kind of a big success in my book. But I think you can plausibly qualify some of the legal interventions like the right to be forgotten, like GDPR, under that rubric. It's just that they all start with a very, I don't want to say mainstream, but they start in kind of German jurisprudence, you know, of, you know, the right to self-determination. They call it, whatever it's called, yeah, something along those lines. Yeah, informationelle Selbstbestimmung. Genau. And, you know, fine, so you can have it. It's a very kind of almost Kantian idea, but it takes no stock whatsoever of like where we are right now in 2019 as a global economy, as a species. You know, it starts, according to me, and this is not where a real political agenda should start. A real political agenda should start with the recognition of justice, you know, who is to blame, because, you know, I'm not as equally to blame for my problems as Google is, you know, for them. So I think it has to start with a narrative that basically tells us something about where to attribute blame. Right? We cannot start with a narrative that just has some kind of 3 or 4 background philosophical concepts like autonomy, and works from there. Like, I think we don't have that luxury anymore, to be honest. So that's why I wouldn't bet on the right to be forgotten or GDPR from resolving our problems, because they never properly conceptualize, and they were never meant to conceptualize, to be honest, the entire problematic field in front of us. But we have to start somewhere else. And the natural tendency of people in Brussels, I'm afraid, will be to keep reaching for this kind of dry concepts and putting them together, because that's what lawyers do. But that's why we need to delegalize, if you will, the debate about the digital. That's why, you know, I've been, so Juan Carlos can tell you, I'm very skeptical and critical of the fact that lawyers in America have completely usurped the debate about the cyber issues. You know, so institutions like the Berkman Center, Stanford Law for Internet and Society, it's all this debate. It's a bunch of lawyers talking about what kind of legal interventions we can have. And it's all well and good, but the times are very different and they call for a very different approach.
Ultima domanda e poi concludiamo.
Hi, my question is very simple. What we can do in our everyday life to avoid this situation in which the freedom is like a cage? And the second part of the question is, in the future, we, as engineers, what we can do, what we can give to the society to improve from this situation?
Yes. Well, you know, I wish I had some kind of a behavioral prescription program, you know, which will tell you should consume these 5 apps, and it will ensure that, you know, you don't go to hell. But I don't think that's the right level of intervention. I mean, I don't want you to do nothing, but I also don't want you to put all the onus of action on you, because, you know, there is a trade-off, right? On the one hand, between efficiency of operations and moral clarity and kind of not living a hypocritical existence. So you can, of course, refuse using Google, you can refuse using Facebook, you can refuse using your credit card, and then, you know, you will be broadcasting your critique about the technological society in some forest from a hut without electricity, right? Or you can make some compromises and get hurt. So I know people who are in the first camp. You know, I would argue that to some extent that was the tactic of Richard Stallman when it came to free software. You know, he deliberately refused to use a graphical web browser. or use a credit card, you know, and I respect him for that. You know, I disrespect him for a lot of other things, but I respect him for that, and he made a very clear choice which essentially allowed him to live in peace with his own philosophy. I think that's not the kind of intervention that we need now. So to think that we will reduce these problems to the level of, you know, kind of fair trade coffee, where you can go and kind of satisfy your conscience by buying a slightly more expensive product, that will be to give in to the rhetoric and logic that Silicon Valley itself would produce. I mean, you already see the services which will offer you privacy and security and will offer you encrypted communications at a small fee. That's not the point, right? So the only action that can clearly change things will be political action done collectively, in collectives, done in parties, done in trade unions if they wake up to these issues, done even in church institutions, to be honest. At this point, you have to work with the society you have, right? Not the society you'd like. So I would not entirely give up on the traditional actors that make up our political sphere. We, of course, need new ones, and we need much better debate on these issues inside those institutions. But I think that I would discourage you from trying to think about it through this everyday perspective, what I can do in my everyday life, because it's the kind of problem that demands structural, long-term collective action. And it's very easy to have a mistaken view of this and then just fall into this path of, you know, I'm changing the world by using another app.
And on these words, let's thank again Evgenij Morozov, and thank you all.
Thank you.